Pero... Buenas tardes, good evening. Today, I had the pleasure just to be talking to Daniel Simpson, which is, in my opinion, one of the most outstanding teachers of yoga and Indian philosophy nowadays. You know, he's the author of a beautiful book I just finished reading, a couple of weeks ago, which is none other than this one, The Truth of Yoga, that we hope that soon could be translated into Spanish. Would be
that would be nice.
Great benefit for those people interested in the practice of yoga and the study of the Indian philosophy. So as I was mentioning, he's the author of this book, The Truth of Yoga, which is a very comprehensive guide to yoga's history, text, philosophy, and practices. I should say that the approach of Daniel is one that combines scholarly knowledge and at the same practice, which is, in my opinion, very important nowadays, since most of the people, real practitioners or followers, but at the same time, you need a very strong base, in order to distinguish or to discriminate how things about yoga move. Daniel is a graduate of Cambridge University and has a master's degree from SOAS University of London. As well, also, Daniel teaches courses at the Oxford Centre of Hindu Studies, as well as around the UK and internationally. If you can visit his page, because he also offers courses online, and his page is full of a great variety and richness in articles. So, Daniel, thank you very much indeed for being here with me. And I am delighted to have this conversation with you about this fantastic and wonderful world of yoga and philosophy.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that generous introduction. That's very kind of you. And I'm looking forward to our conversation. If anyone's curious, truthofyoga.com is where they'll find everything that they might be wanting to delve into.
All right, I invite all those people who can see us to visit it. I'm not going to start asking you what yoga is about, because first of all, yoga, everybody knows, although not with a precise thought about what it is. But let's us put it like this. Yoga is full of different methods or different techniques, and people practice it from different perspectives. So nowadays, in modern times, the modern yoga is like a monochromatic type of yoga, which means asanas, asanas, and asanas. And at the same time, you add a name, like whatever it is, Rajaga yoga, Astanga yoga, and so on and so forth. So I'd like to know your opinion about this modern yoga, how vast it is, how it is spreading all over the world, and millions of people practice it. But I want to know your opinion about if the notion most of the people have about yoga, is it real yoga? Is it only asanas? Is it only a physical exercise? Is it at the same time a type of medicalized exercise in order to gain well-being physically and mentally? Thus, all of this loses the gist of yoga, which is the essence of yoga?
A very big question with many, many layers. I think perhaps the simplest way to approach it is to acknowledge something that's very important, I think, that often gets buried in people's ideas of what yoga is. Yoga has never been one thing. There are many approaches to yoga, many schools of yoga, sure, but there are also many different things that get the name yoga. Some of them in the very earliest of Indian texts having nothing to do with meditation or transcendent insight or any of the things we might associate with yoga later. it's just a word. It means usually something to do with joining things together, but also doesn't necessarily mean that. So there are many, many different meanings the word can have, and they change over time. And I think, what we see today is part of really the third big phase of yoga history. The focus on the body, the use of the body as a tool, perhaps just as a way of feeling more comfortable in the body and therefore more content in life. That might be the first level. It's also possible through working with the body to work on the mind and subtler aspects of being embodied. And that starts to take us back to the previous phase of yoga history, which was much more about using the body to work on the mind, the medieval physical yoga, which is still very different to what we see today. And even before that, the oldest phase of yoga is really just about stepping away from the world and stepping away even from the body, not really being interested in doing things with the body. Until 1,000 years ago, there weren't descriptions in texts of doing anything with the body except sitting still or putting it through very uncomfortable experiences to try and detach from it. So hold the arm in the air for as long as you can, hopefully the rest of your life. And very quickly it gets painful and you have to ignore the pain. And that's a fast track to the ultimate project of yoga, of disconnecting from the need to have reality be any particular way, instead to just be internally focused, facing the world as it is, but very much internal, not external. So giving up a concern for managing external conditions and instead being concerned only with going deeper and deeper inwards until there's actually no real interest in the world at all. So leaving the world behind was the first phase of yoga. Obviously today, not many people are leaving the world behind, but that doesn't mean that they're inauthentic in their yoga practice. It's quite possible to get to some of the richer and more transformative states that yoga texts talk about through doing regular asana practice. And it really all therefore depends on our priorities. It depends on how we understand our objectives, and also how we understand all the other things that have been called yoga in all of the previous centuries. So we need to study, I think, a little bit in order to understand what yoga is. It doesn't just reveal itself automatically. Obviously, there are experiences we can have, but to make sense of them, we need some context. That context often comes from a teacher, but that also kind of requires the teacher to have a knowledge of deeper framing of the practice, and also, I guess, ways of communicating that sound relevant to the student. So we're all, I guess, trying to find our way. And many people before us have been trying to find their way too, and we can get inspiration from them, but none of them have tried to find the way that we're trying to find. So we will have to, in the modern time, reinterpret things, because we're living in the 21st century. You in Vigo, me west of Oxford in the English countryside. Nobody wrote an ancient yoga text about these conditions. So, we have to adapt things. And that's happened all throughout yoga history. People have been adapting things. But until recently, nobody admitted it. So everybody makes it sound as if yoga is timeless. It comes from many thousand years ago. Nothing ever changed. And yet, so many things are different now. And I think the more we can understand that history, the clearer we can be about where we are, what we want to do, and how that maybe relates to some of these other things, and maybe keep some of the spirit of those practices or philosophies, even if we don't want to approach life in the same way. And perhaps the simplest way of summing the whole thing up is, if you were to stand at the front of a modern yoga class and ask people, did you come to this room to escape from rebirth? Please put up your hand if you did. Nobody will put up their hand. But originally, that's what people practiced yoga for. In fact, they didn't even think of it as practicing yoga. They did whatever it was they were doing to attain the state of yoga, which was detachment from the idea of being a person, and going beyond this sort of very limited identification with experience as the voice in the head, this particular covering of flesh, and instead went to another place. And so that's all obviously a huge topic, but maybe some seeds there of ideas we could explore a little more.
Yes. Mentioning or going back a tiny bit to what you mentioned just right a few seconds ago. Of course, everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. In other words, when we had to face something that we had to extinguish, our life sooner or later is going to be extinguished. Yes. We have to abandon the body, or the body has to abandon us. I remember some of the masters I was with. One of them used to say, you know, before you are given the sack, ask for the bill or something like that, you know, in other words. He's trying to say that make the effort in this life in order to go beyond the identification of your body and your mind, which is very typical in yoga. You mentioned quite clearly that in our Western society, of course, we take very much care of our body and our mind. And if you compare this to the asceticism, the tapas, as you mentioned before, you had to be there for 8 years. When you wanted to raising your arm there, when you wanted to bring it down, was impossible because of the
stuck.
And not to move, probably not to get any karma. So I want to go through a few words which are very familiar to those people who practice yoga, and for those who don't, I know you are going to explain it quite clearly. Like, for instance, let us take samsara, let us take karma, let us take for a moment avidya. So, in other words, sometimes we talk about destiny, the fatality of life. Life happens because it has to happen. But when we come into the world of yoga or Hinduism, we come across with the word karma. Would you extend a tiny bit about this?
Well, the word karma, it's a Sanskrit word that just means action. And action in the very earliest Indian religion was very important. The Vedic religion was all about activity on the part of the priests, making offerings to gods, hoping that the gods would then bless us with the things we needed for a good life. So it was about material benefits in the form of, good weather, enough to eat, fertility, prosperity, good fortune in war. And it was also therefore about the action having particular outcome. And yoga philosophy is the exact opposite of that. It starts to see action as problematic because it has outcomes that affect the mind. And this analysis is there in the earliest of the Upanishads, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. And it says, very simply that we have this sort of cycle in the mind. We desire things. We want the world to provide us with our satisfaction somehow. So we resolve to do something to get satisfied. And then we go out and act on that resolve. And this action has a consequence on the mind because we either get what we want, in which case we usually want more, or we get frustrated, in which case we feel annoyed and start to re-strategize. So this sort of process of the interaction of activity and conscious processing, which is often at the unconscious level, let's be honest, is something that just spirals and spirals and spirals. It keeps us acting. So to put it as simply as possible, the earliest idea about yoga was no more action, no more problem. Don't want anything ever again. Don't do anything ever again. Be like these old ascetics, just sit still. And there were some who really did perfect it to the point of give up the body, give up this life. And that's, it's very radical, it's extreme. But hidden in there, I think, is the seed of something that became popularized by the Buddha most clearly, the idea that there's a middle way between total indulgence of the senses, giving in to desire, and also at the same time seeing the possibility of not doing that. Somewhere in between, you can have a more skillful approach to life. And all these different traditions have approached that with an understanding that there is a consequence. So the more we invest in an expectation of an outcome, the more problematic it is. And obviously there's philosophy in the yoga tradition in the Bhagavad Gita that's very strongly influenced, I think, by the Buddha's ideas that if you can just manage the investment in the action, then you don't have to worry too much about the outcome, because it's something that you've already abandoned. You've got no interest in it. So desire is the root of the problem, really, rather than action. There's no reason why we shouldn't act in the world if we can manage our understanding of how we relate to that action. So in the end, karma isn't a problem, but for the earliest yogis, it was. It's just a fact of life. The Buddha really summed it up as cause and effect. There's a never-ending cycle. In Buddhism, there's nowhere to go apart from to see clearly that the cycle is spinning.
The reason why I do ask you this question, because it's nowadays very many people say karma is your karma, be careful for karma. And don't have that ego, because the ego is a very big obstacle and you're going to create karma, so on and so forth. People in the circles of yogi circles, they even teachers, they seem to me the most, how could I say that? The most sad and serious people in the world. It's impossible to, and so strict, they look like warriors. They look like belong to the military thing there. Instead of, on the other side, when we come for a moment to meditation or whatever, vipassana, or dhyana or whatever, in that sense, you try to control your mind, but everything is so serious, so strongly restricted about your life, that I don't see people who practice yoga like this, with this attitude, enjoy life at all. They suffer it. So I was saying about meditation and mindfulness, they, however, speak nowadays more about metta, loving, kindness, and this and that. Right?
Well, I think you've hit on a very important topic there, really. I mean, traditionally, early yoga was all about restraint. So this first phase of yoga history was just let's get everything under control and disappear. Thankfully, the reason we've got a different idea about yoga, there was another philosophy that was very influential on yoga's development, the tantric philosophy that said, well, okay, everything is just part of this interaction of energy and consciousness, and therefore the body is just another aspect of the divine. All of it comes from this sort of single source expanding out into diversity, and we can find our way back to the clarity of that singularity through any point, including the body. You have to do the right things, you have to get the right teacher, you have to get initiated, chant the mantra, etc., etc. But still, the idea was the body is no longer the enemy. So there is in the yoga tradition the seed of something we can enjoy ourselves so long as we don't get still attached. So there is this problem of attachment causes suffering, but there isn't a requirement to walk around like a prisoner in your yoga practice. But a lot of people do, because a lot of us come to yoga, I think, to heal ourselves. We're not feeling good, and something about the practice makes us feel better. And often people get addicted to the practice. They need to do it, a lot of it, almost in a punishing themselves way, thinking it will lead somewhere pure. And I mean, I can speak for myself. A lot of the time, that sort of approach just led to me punishing myself. It gave me injuries, or made me miserable, or lonely, or poor, having no income, sitting around living in a virtual cave, but then still wondering, well, how do I then pay the rent? So, it's unrealistic, I think, to do those sorts of things. And Buddhism, yes, has the same tradition, but Buddhism is also really, as well as being a monastic religion, broadened out these ideas into a way that people who just live around the monks in ordinary society can still be involved. Yoga isn't quite the same. Yoga is part, I mean, obviously we then get into complicated territory. Yoga is associated with many different ideas, some religious, some not, some that we would call Hinduism, some not. But broadly speaking, there is an aspect of Hindu religion that yoga fits into. And the connection between the two is the word dharma. And this idea of what's the right thing to do is basically the question behind this word dharma. And that makes the two worlds come together. But in Buddhism, there aren't two worlds to come together. Dharma just means, you know, the teachings of the Buddha, and it's also how to live, and it's much more sort of connected in that sense. Whereas yoga, I think, is about not living in the world. Most of other teachings of Hinduism have got everything to do with being in the world, and Dharma is very important. So I think often the yoga teachings, especially if you turn to these classical yoga texts like Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, even the medieval physical yoga texts, they're for world renouncers, and all they really talk about is how to shut everything down. So there aren't actually texts associated with yoga practice until very recently that talk about how to live in the world like a happy person. Whereas the Buddhist tradition has basically said, you know, you just do a few basic things and then you carry on your worldly life, and maybe in the next life you get a bit more merit. But those basic things are very helpful. It's, you know, compassion, kindness, generosity. Those will, you know, take a little bit of the sting out of the poison in the mind. So even if you don't get enlightened, you might still be a nicer person. Obviously, it depends on people doing that. It's not that Buddhists are all wonderfully kind necessarily, but there is that idea a bit more seeded. And I think, you know, in the Western world, what happens instead is because the yoga texts are not so well integrated with the idea of how to live in the world, people add all sorts of funny ideas of their own. So a lot of new age magical thinking from the Western world of the last 100 years or so comes into what yoga teachers think about karma. And then also perhaps inherited ideas from Christianity about, you know, punishment, as if there's some sort of sky fairy looking down and, you know, dispensing natural justice. You know, do good things, good results come, do bad things, bad results come. I know a lot of people who did a lot of bad things who never got punished. I also know a lot of people who did a lot of good things and didn't get rewards. It doesn't work like that. It's to do with, you know, the impact of your actions on your mind, and you carry your own suffering that you help to create. And that's what we can learn to unwind, and then we can be nicer people. So I think there is in yoga texts the seeds of that philosophy. It's all come from the same place anyway, yoga and Buddhism. It's, you know, the renouncer ideas of 2,500 years ago plus. So we can, I think, from that, if we go sort of like archaeologists trying to dig things up carefully and brush them off, we can find, you know, instructions on how to live well in the world. But the texts aren't written that way, and actually the ideas in them are always towards, you know, this disappearing, not doing. And so I think on some subtle level, people internalize that and they try to get themselves under control, and they hope they're going to break through to some better world. But there's only this world that we know about now. I mean, who knows what comes after this one? Right now we're here, and time is ticking. And I've become clearer and clearer that, you know, it's how we are in each moment with ourselves, with other people, that is more important. Never mind trying to go beyond anything. What about now? What can we do here now to, you know, live a fuller life and perhaps embody some of these ideas about kindness? That to me would be a life better lived than sitting in the cave, you know, hoping that somehow I might go up in a puff of smoke or suddenly be able to read through, you know, 20 layers of past lives.
Don't you think that all these ideas actually come due to the main texts that we tend to read, like the Upanishads, like the Bhagavad Gita, even the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali? For instance, you go to Patanjali and they mention, okay, yoga is what? Samadhi. Okay, but now, according to our society and our education, we come to know this big debate among the body-mind problem and consciousness. But we just solve this problem and say, no, you just meditate and you do dhyana yoga and you're going to reach samadhi, sampranyata, and then you go into asampranyata, samadhi, whatever, as easy as that. And these other people are trying to, you know, of course, not debate between monism and dualism, mind, body, problem, mind, brain, all these type of things. So we can't escape from all this dialogue, you know. That's why, in my opinion, at the same time, neuroscience, contemplative neuroscience comes and appears and say, okay, if you practice meditation, all these benefits are you going to get because the brain is going to change the function and the structure and so forth. And most of the people nowadays practice, let's say, mindfulness due to that we accept that. But it's out of context probably because meditation, the meaning we give, I mean, according to Buddhism and Hinduism and so on and so forth, has a different meaning. What do you think about this? I mean, this division, this in between, you know, how we take it nowadays for the well-being of body, mind, health. But at the same time, I know asceticism, monks, and so on, so renunciants, sannyasis, and so on and so forth, their aim in life is to go beyond that famous, to go beyond the body-mind mechanisms. You know, I remember being with Ramesh Bashikar, by the way, and he was, no, you had to go beyond the body-mind mechanisms and so on forth, or Punjaji or Nisargadatta Maharaj. So, and when for a moment we come to the Upanishads in these great Mahavakyas, Aham Brahmasmi, that also influences us as far as thinking that, of course, we need just to be pure in the practice of Vedanta, if it is Advaita Vedanta, just to go beyond the ego and reach that the heightness of the consciousness. So, as you mentioned, as you have all these courses online about the Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, in which there are much to say about that, since Philip Maas has his theory about it, and many other authors have a different one. So I'd like to give, you know, like an approach. I know it's a big topic for that. I recommend people to go to your courses and be there. So I say some part of the Upanishads, you know, and the Bhagavad Gita, where the main yogas are over there, that Vivekananda spoke about them, and therefore anybody can practice yoga from their perspective, from their own personality, I should say. And then the famous Yoga Sutras of Patanjali or Patanjali Yoga Shastra, whatever you call it.
Well, we can obviously overcomplicate things very easily, and humans are very good at that, and academics are particularly good at it. They love complexity and problems, and noting that things don't fit together the way we like to imagine, and there are all these different approaches. They can't all be right. They're contradicting each other. They're debating each other. We can get lost in that forever. But there is a simple common thread to most teachings about this idea of going beyond. And it's very simple. It's just, you are not your mind. I mean, perhaps the simplest summary that I ever read was exactly those words, Eckhart Tolle in The Power of Now. He's stolen lots of ideas from all these ancient traditions, repackaged them in a very, very effective bestseller. But that basic message is it. You are not your mind. You don't really need any more instruction than that. There isn't actually anywhere else to go unless you want to kill yourself. We're still here, but it's just not to be so identified with things in the same way, and particularly not the idea of myself in the mind. So it's not even that the idea, the ego is the enemy. That's another way to just go to war with yourself. It's just to be a little bit clearer about, that we have this tendency to get stuck, and we can be more aware of how that works. We can see the patterns and we can loosen them a little bit. But no ancient text describes it that way. And in fact, it's really helpful, I think, to look at the old texts, firstly, to see how different they are, how different some of the assumptions they were based on are to the way that we are in the modern world choosing to live. We have homes, we have responsibilities, we're stuck in neoliberal capitalism, we have bills to pay. So there's all these complications that we can't escape. We are part of our context, but there is still something very simple at the core of the idea of practice. We can suffer less. The fundamental meaning of freedom in the context of yoga is from suffering. Never mind if there's the next life, never mind if it's dual, non-dual, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what philosophy it is. We can suffer less. So in the end, that's sort of number one point on the algorithm for me when trying to construct a modern 21st century way of leaving this is, binary question. Is this leading to more suffering or less suffering? And that's what we're trying to do, I think, with yoga, is to find less suffering. So we need to be honest with ourselves. we've got those two principles, ahimsa, causing less harm, and satya, telling the truth, as the sort of two of Patanjali's yamas. They crop up on most lists of good things, and they are good things. You can balance them by being clear with yourself honestly. Am I causing more suffering, or am I diminishing suffering for myself and for other people? With all of with just those two things, you can build a whole philosophy. Gandhi built his whole political philosophy out of those two things effectively. I mean, he's no saint, he's another human being with his flaws, but it'd be hard to argue that he didn't achieve things and that they didn't inspire people. And I think there's a lot we can do with just those two basic ingredients. And obviously there's many more ideas in yoga texts. But I do think we have to keep coming back to the reality that we'll have to try and find our own way of integrating this into modern life. Yes, pretending that we're going to get it all from the Yoga Sutra, as you were suggesting. I'm just going to meditate and I'm going to work my way through all these layers, and then I'm just going to disconnect from Prakriti forevermore. It's I've yet to see somebody who did that. Even some of these very wonderful teachers who you've been mentioning, who are sitting there telling you about you've got to go beyond the body mind. While they're sitting there telling you that, they're not beyond the body mind. They're permanently in this duality of me talking to you, and that's how they're having the conversation, and that's fine. They're aware that there's another reality, and they're suggesting we should look for it. That's great. But it's not actually possible, I don't think, to live in that reality all the time and function in modern society. You can only really just inhabit that space if, in the same way that you take a strong psychedelic, you're not at the same time capable perhaps of driving a car or holding a conversation with your grandparents or whatever it might be. Maybe you can, I don't know, depends on the person. But there's a strong altered state is a different state, and it's not necessarily the state of day-to-day life. And the old philosophies, they recognize that. Advaita Vedanta, Buddhism, they talk about two levels of truth, really. There's the ultimate truth, and then there's the functional truth for day-to-day purposes. And that distinction seems to have got lost a little bit in the modern era. Everybody wants to talk about the ultimate while actually living in the relative. Be a bit more honest if we could admit we live in the relative, and we can use some of these ideas to inhabit that space more helpfully. Because otherwise, if everybody wants the ultimate, nobody cares about the relative. It's almost, as long as I go up in my rocket to wherever this place beyond is, who cares about everything down there? I've got no concern for it. And that's the sort of mindset that's given us this destruction potentially of life on Earth in a very short and very near and very worrying future. So I think we need to care about each other and the world. And again, you don't find that message much in yoga texts because they're all about how to program your rocket ship for beyond. So we need to think about how to integrate some of those ideas in here now.
There is a last question probably, because I want to take too much time from you now. Let's go back for a minute to Hatha Yoga, okay? All these famous texts. There is the famous Parampara, where the Guru tradition, he teaches and he orally, he was teaching to his disciple and so on and so forth. And it was like an inheritance of that teaching, continuing for very many years or centuries or whatever you want to call it. So when we come, nowadays, we find different famous texts in Hatha Yoga, as probably the most famous one so far, Hatha Yoga Pradipika, Garanda Samhita, and the Shiva Samhita. But as you are very well aware of the Hatha Yoga project with Jim Mallinson and Mark Singleton and Jason Birch. So all these texts from the medieval times, let's say from the, I think, from the 10th century, more or less, the Amrita Siddhi, which is a Buddhist text according to Jim. Mm-hmm. And, very many other, Gorosha Shataka and so on and so forth. So the asanas, which seem to be very old, which seems to be very modern, how do they really appear? When you read these texts according to them, there are not many asanas over there. I think the Hatha Yoga Pradipika has like 16, like 4 sitting and 11, asanas there. But previous to those centuries, that was the oral tradition passing the knowledge from one to the other, from one tradition to the other, sramanas and so forth, so on and so forth. So was a practice of Hatha Yoga previous to the medieval times. Hatha yoga actually is a consequence from Tantra or Tantrism.
Well, I think we have to be humble when we talk about these things, and sometimes scholars aren't so humble because they need to be clear and assertive with strong declarative arguments. But the reality is we just don't know how much we don't know. You're right. The yoga was taught orally from teacher to student. Without a time machine, we have no way of knowing what those gurus said to their students. We don't even know who the students were. All we have are these texts which give a kind of idealized version of the practices, missing out a lot of the important details you would need. In fact, in the text, they often say you need to get more instruction from your teacher.
Probably they know how to write or to read. There was
most of these texts are written for marketing purposes. They're publicity. They're like, our lineage is better than your lineage. Look at all the sort of wonderful practices we've got and how effective they are. Maybe they're there as a sort of memory guide for teachers of teachers, the senior teachers of the time, just to make sure that somebody's got that knowledge locked away in a cupboard in case anybody needs it. But bottom line, it's an oral tradition. So we just don't know, honestly. What we do know, though, is that there are lots of other literary traditions in India, whether they're narrative, poetry, texts about organizing society, and all of these different genres of text mention yogis at different phases of their history. And there are no descriptions of yogis doing anything other than sitting or doing all these painful things to their bodies, standing on one leg for a long time, holding the arms in the air, until around the 10th century, as you say, when a couple of quite obscure traditions of temple Vaishnavism come up with the idea of balancing on your arms. The first two non-seated postures, Mayurasana and Kukutasana, taught in those traditions of texts that go on to influence the Yoga Yajnavalkya. So there's different strands coming up in the evolution of physical yoga practice. And I think what you have is a collision between 2 or 3 different influences. So there was that old tradition of meditative, clarity of vision, turning inwards, seeing beyond. And the Upanishads started that whole conversation and gave the framework for it. Then there's the tradition of the ascetics, who don't really have a philosophy other than, we need to stop this problem of karma. And the simplest way to deal with the problem of desire is to hurt myself so that I give up trying to make myself feel better. And there's that. So doing painful things to the body. And then there's the tantric influence, as you say, which is that we can transform the body. We don't have to beat it up or go beyond it. We can live in it and do things with it. And all those 3 things come together.
Well,
so some texts,
the same thing. In early Christianity, the fathers of the desert, they
absolutely
were the same thing.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. And there are many other traditions around the world that are engaged in these sort of different ways of trying to explore. Sometimes punishing themselves, sometimes less so, sometimes having ecstatic experiences. But bottom line is that nobody has talked about yogis doing anything other than the punishing of the body or the sitting still and meditating thing until about 1,000 years ago. So Jim Mallinson is pretty confident. I don't know, we can say any more than there are no texts that show that people did Hatha yoga until about 1,000 years ago, but he's pretty clear that this is a new thing. Why it happened at that time, he can't explain. It just did. But what we can see after that is a slow evolution. And the first text, as you say, the Amrita Siddhi, doesn't call its practice Hatha yoga, doesn't teach any asanas. Right. It's all about the manipulation of subtle energies in the body, mainly through 3 mudras. And the mudra practice, which is using the body, putting it into a position, holding it for a while and working with the breath, that's the real dynamic practice of medieval physical yoga. The inclusion of more and more asanas, which in the Hatha Pradipika were described basically as warm-ups, things that you do to prepare the body for this harder practice of pranayama, mudra, and eventually meditation. That suggests that there's perhaps increasing popularity of this practice. People who've got less and less experience with being able to sit still or tolerate holding their breath for a very long time. And so there's this need to soften things up a bit. So a bit like, the Westerners come to India and want lots of yoga practice, and teachers start, giving them more and more asana to do, and less emphasis on the other aspects of yoga teaching. But we don't know. We just know that there are more texts speaking about more postures. So whether all they're doing is pulling out of the forest the things that the other practitioners were doing and putting them in text, or whether they're inventing new things, is very difficult to say. But again, I think we can notice one very important thing. No text before the modern era talks about sequences of postures. So the idea that postures were the practice is a modern thing. You find that in 20th century texts onwards. The only thing we do find is, which is why one text in particular that the Hatha Yoga Project has been working on is really interesting, the Hatha Abhyasa Paddhati. It's called the Manual of Physical Practice, basically. Looking in that text, there are lots of complicated postures. Some of them are practiced one after another, and they're organized in groups. And they've clearly got some influence from other things that people did with their bodies in India in the 18th century, whether it's wrestling, martial arts, dance, other things that required strength and flexibility. And it says that the point of posture in that text is to make your body strong and flexible. It then goes on to teach other aspects of yoga as well. But this idea, that's the first place that you start to hear about those two things, using the body for its own sake and joining postures together to get more strength and flexibility. Otherwise, there were different things.
That comes later with the Ashtanga Yoga of Patabi Joyce, or what?
Well, that seems to be the suggestion. The suggestion is that this text might have been one of the inspirations for Krishnamacharya to present what he presented to people like Patabi Joyce, and that Patabi Joyce then systematized as Ashtanga sequences. It was copied, this text, into another text called the Sri Tattva Nidhi. Most of the postures appear there, made in a different order with illustrations. The scholar Norman Schoeman put together a very interesting book, The Yoga Tradition of the Mysore Palace, in the mid-1990s, that really started this process of investigating where do all these postures come from. He practiced with Iyengar even before Iyengar had an institute in Pune, and he was just curious. Here we have all these things that everybody does, but they're not in any of the texts. We're still no closer to an answer, but standing postures, sun salutations, linking everything together, no evidence of that even in the 18th century. So these seem to be new ingredients that come as people get more and more focused on using the body. And that's, I think, part of the modernization of life, and the fact that all around the world, people get interested in physical fitness in the 19th century and early 20th century. It's to do with an attempt to make yoga more popular by Indian teachers in the early 20th century, consciously trying to produce something that could be packaged in classes for people who didn't want to renounce the world. And obviously that's what we've now taken and run with. And then maybe just very simply, there's obviously the old yoga text said, asana is a preliminary, and it leads to meditation, perhaps, if you do it in the correct way, if you then go on to do some meditation. There are also descriptions of physical benefits. So the idea of health and wellness gets developed. And once that starts, then this is the most accessible way in. You can also develop your concentration through paying attention to asana. So it's appealing, and it's got a life of its own now. We can't reverse it, but it would be fascinating to know, where some of these things have come from. And in the end, I don't think we're going to get an answer. I think it's one of the eternal mysteries of the yoga tradition, where all the postures came from, how many there ever were in the first place, whether Hatha Yoga goes back longer than we think. The problem is really, what can we prove? And if we're going to talk about this stuff academically, we have to have evidence. But my gut instinct is perhaps, we'll never know just how much was going on beyond the radar. It's like, as an example I like to use, if somebody tried to say that they knew everything about me based on what I post on social media, they obviously would be having a very, very limited perspective on what I am. They might have some good guesses based on, seeing through my psychology, the way I write things or whatever, but they're still not going to know that much about me. And that's all we've got for the yoga tradition, the equivalent of a few social media posts in these texts. The rest of life is lost. We don't know.
Yeah. because before, this is just about to end, before I used to go to India to see gurus, different gurus. They used to come then to the West. He was the authority. You used to sit next to them and listen to their talks and so forth, practice with them, living an ashram, all this type of yogic living. Nowadays, the academics like yourself and many others are putting a different basis over there, you know, in order just to study from a different standpoint, and at the same time, just see where this thing is coming from. In other words, that popularity of the, although of course nowadays like Ramdev in India, so you see Shankar and many others are over there, and many people follow them, millions of people all over the world, of course. But a new dimension the yoga is taking nowadays due to the scholarly study of texts and where the yoga is coming from and so on and so forth. But a final consideration, I should say, for instance, the Vedas were never written. They were not written. They were orally transmitted. I think it was Max Muller, or perhaps before him, somebody was trying just to have them written down, and was not popular among the Brahmins, right?
Well, I think the first writing of the Vedas, I may be wrong here, but I think the Harvard scholar Mikhail Witzel has said it's about 1,000 years ago that the Vedas were
like
written
in the
down.
14th century, somebody did that. Yeah. But finally, just I would like to clarify, if you can clarify this for me anyway. Okay, the Upanishads. Okay, you mentioned this book in your course. You're going to teach about the Upanishads.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So very well written. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Chandogya, Katha, and so on and so forth. You got them written here. So if this knowledge was transmitted orally, when was it written? Because you go to the Upanishads and you date them back around the 800, 700 BCE or whatever. So how is it possible to have such a faithful way of writing all the contents to start with?
In the introduction, Patrick Olivelle does say any attempt to date these things any more precisely than a couple of centuries is going to be crazy guesswork. So no one really knows, to be honest. But there are a few things that scholars have worked with over the years to try and make sense of things. At least the Chandogya and the Brihadaranyaka Upanishads seem to be talking about ideas that the Buddha is then arguing against. And so there's a suggestion that in their earliest form, they must be older than the life of the Buddha. The life of the Buddha can be dated, not least because of the inscriptions of Ashoka and then the sort of working backwards from these dates. So you've got some idea when the Buddha lived. And some of the early Upanishads are before that time. But the ideas in them, they've come from somewhere else. I'm not sure that the Upanishads were the source of some of these ideas. They were probably, as you say, these guys who are known as Shramanas, strivers. That literally means people doing, yogic stuff in a very demanding, self-disciplined way. Those are the origins of Buddhism, Jainism, yoga traditions, even, people who had no religion at all, who were just, trying to understand the nature of reality. But we don't find anything about that in the earliest layer of the Vedas. And in fact, as I was saying, the whole philosophy of the earliest layer of the Vedas is exactly the opposite. It's about doing things for the sake of results. Action is a wonderful thing. It's all about action, and it's all about the gods. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad says the problem is that we can be the same thing as the gods, and the gods don't like that. So we've disappointed them because we no longer need to do the ritual. So they've just completely ripped up the whole of the earlier Vedic religion. So I don't think we can realistically claim that predates those earlier Vedas. No one really knows the earliest date of the Vedas, as you say. But again, there's educated guesswork based on the migration that is described in the Vedas themselves. These are groups of people, they're nomadic, they're moving eastward across northern India, and they're coming into conflict, and they're asking the gods to bless them in their battles. So there's suggestions from the texts themselves about when they were composed, but we can't pin it down for sure, and nobody knows what was there before that either. So many mysteries, but
Like the battlefield in the Bhagavad Gita and so on and so forth. So that's so many discussions about that. Just to end up, if you would like, I think, do you know any story that can illustrate something of the teaching of yoga? A short one? It comes to your mind?
Well, I've just been preparing this course on the Katha Upanishad. I mean, it's on the whole of the Upanishads, but the Katha Upanishad is really the centerpiece. It's the only early Upanishad that talks in detail about yoga. There's also the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, but that's a bit unclear what date some of that yoga stuff creeps in there. And the Katha Upanishad has a very simple story. It's about a young man who winds up having a dialogue with death. And to cut a very long story short, he gets to ask death 3 questions. And the first 2 are, they're quite sort of, I guess, worldly in the first case and a bit esoteric in the second case. In the third case, it's very clear and very straightforward. Your death, you know the truth about what happens when this body is no longer here. So tell me. And death doesn't want to tell this boy the answer, and he has to earn the right to get an answer. And the way he earns the right to get an answer is to not be interested in material things. Death tries to bribe him with money, with beautiful women, with promise of wealth and land and all sorts of other stuff. He's not interested in material results. He wants spiritual insight. So that's the first lesson, really, as a yoga practitioner. If you haven't got that, hunger for something beyond the material world, then all you're going to do is use yoga to rationalize the same old stuff. In the same way, we all know yoga teachers who are more attached to the body than anybody else, and who are more egomaniacs than anybody else. Right. But you can use it to go subtler. And death tells this guy Nachiketas, there are really 2 things in life: that which is beneficial and that which is temporarily satisfying. And most of us, we get sort of hooked on this temporarily satisfying stuff. You've proven that you're not satisfied by that. You've proven you're interested in the beneficial. So now I'm going to tell it to you. And he gets this sort of insight, which is basically the model for chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita, explaining that, the Atman is timeless. You just have to see through your illusion. And the way to do that is to turn inwards, and it's located in the heart. So I think we can build out of that, a very, very, very simple philosophy of, it's not about what's between your ears. It's about the quality of what's in here, and opening into that and trying to live with the wisdom from that place might make it a little bit easier to be less obsessed with stuff, status, and the idea that something's going to survive me, a quest for immortality in the sense of doing impressive deeds. Instead, maybe you live on in people's memories by being a nice person, and focus instead on this path of what is beneficial. And that's the same language that the Buddha was using. He was talking about trying to cultivate that which is wholesome, beneficial, skillful, and get rid of all the stuff that's unhelpful, unskillful. So the yoga path's very simple. We just have to keep weighing 2 things up. Everybody wants to talk about oneness and non-duality, and that's a great way to switch the brain off. Right. Yoga requires the brain to be on, so assessing all the time, helpful, unhelpful, suffering, less suffering. So it's basically that. It's a balancing act, and that's the kind of balance that matters, not whether you can do a fancy posture.
Quite agree to that. Okay, Daniel, thank you very much for your inspiring, and wise words.
Oh, thank you. I must give all credit to my teachers, to be honest. I wouldn't know any of this if they hadn't shared it.
I am quite sure it'll be of great help to the people who are going to see this video. And really, I am very thankful for your time, and the way you have been expressing all these type of things, and finishing with this beautiful story of Nachiketas and Yama, Lord Yama. And anyhow, so we'll be in touch, and we'll see this and announce it. Si es posible que este libro de Daniel pueda ser traducido al español. We'll try just to convince somebody in order to translate your book into Spanish.
That would be wonderful.
Beautiful gift for all of us over here. So thanks a lot again. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you again for inviting me. Yeah. And likewise.
We'll be in touch. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.